Thank you, Mr. Taylor, for your inspiring words, as always. We're so blessed to have you with us here today. I'd like to move on to introduce our keynote speaker for today. She's traveled, she's had an epic journey to arrive to our borderlands from the northern borderlands in Canada, in British Columbia. It's my great honor and privilege to introduce a colleague, a dear friend and sister and mentor and teacher. She's a rarity in this world. Dr. Margot Thomas is of the Lipan Apache Band of Texas, the Konitsae Nende peoples from the lower Rio Grande Valley in Texas. She is an associate professor in the Indigenous Studies program at the University of British Columbia. She is the author of critically acclaimed books, Naked Wanting, published in 2003, and Raven Eye, published in 2007. Her critical creative interests are located in Inde oral history, poetry, and poetics, Inde enduring Aboriginal land rights, self-determination, race, and gender. She sustains focus on meanings which Inde peoples place on beingness, belongingness, and commemorative enactments of homeland, genocide-induced trauma, and dispossession. Her work foregrounds kinship epistemologies within Inde, Nawa, Umano, and Comanche River peoples' kinship systems, emphasizing gender, culture, fluid agency, which controverts ethno-historical Lipan Apaches. She conveys Inde decolonization as nascent through community epistemology and mother-daughter rivered remembering. Her book project, entitled Inde Peoples Remain, Refusing Dispossession and Remembering Genocide, 1546 to 2017, weaves memory, law, history, poetics, and poetry. This is a much abbreviated version of her much larger bio. Please help me in welcoming Dr. Margot Thomas.
Before I begin my talk, I just want to say a couple of things. First, thank you so much for all of the care that went into this program today, and the care with which we were initiated and invited into this space and reacquainted with this land and the peoples of this land and the generosity of the indigenous peoples and the burgeoning generosity, I know, that is founded upon many generations of deep care as well as incredible tensions still unresolved between original peoples, original nations, and many, many indigenous peoples who traveled in Kaye, a long walk, who live here now today, and their ancestors came from many places, as well as many peoples who were pushed out of other places around the world too. And I want to always acknowledge that. And yet today, there's so much forgetting about those processes. So I want to thank everybody for all of the care and the intentions. So I want to also thank Dr. Bejarano for initiating the proposal to bring me here. So thank you, and thank you to everybody who participated in that decision making and for your generosity to me. I wish to extend my gratitude to the symposium organizers as well. I'm going to just squat down a little bit and put this down here. I'm afraid I'm going to toss my glasses. People who know me know I get very excited when I start flailing my arms when I'm talking. And to the Honorable J. Paul Taylor, I'm learning so much about you today. What an honor. For your many years of distinguished and dedicated service and your long-term commitment to being a champion with and alongside marginalized peoples and communities of New Mexico. I am now a fan of yours on Facebook. along with 654 of your Facebook followers. Now that is a relevant scorecard, if there ever was one. In all seriousness, I wish to express my appreciation and respect to the many indigenous peoples upon whose homelands we are gathered today. And it is especially a poignant moment for me to be here as well, with and for and alongside my people, the Ende and the Ene. Living, working, and subsisting today in the Symp people's territory. They are anthropologically known as the Okanagan, though in their language that is a word that means people who have just cut their hair. Okanagan. So, that's another talk, right? There is, I have a great appreciation and respect for these processes today, because I live in a place that has undergone 6, 7, 8 years now of a very important process with regard to truth-seeking and historical clarification in the context of indigenous genocide, a 100-year process of stripping and separating children from their communities, and many peoples left behind with empty arms for 100 years. And so it's a very complex process to understand trauma. And so I come to you today with a trauma-informed lens, specifically under the rise and the close of a 6-year Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. I have gained a more critical understanding of Indigenous peoples' protocols as crucial enactments of reclaiming their rightful relationship to sovereignty, lands, and recognition. There is a sacred, robust, and somber magnitude in opening the 14th annual J. Paul Taylor Social Justice Symposium with an official welcome and blessing by distinguished and dignified representative members who are the Tortuga leaders and community members, who are original nations with an ongoing indigenous territorial belonging and struggles for recognition by members of the non-indigenous society. And so with that said, I've decided to focus my remarks today on this enactment. In my perspective, this enactment of belonging, this is so potent because the recognition of Indigenous protocol in the wake of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in North America reminds me how crucial, how intricately our communities are related, which are currently divided by settler colonial borders. My people, of course, have many, many creation stories and migration stories, which put us crucially in the area around Great Slave Lake, Great Bear Lake, and the Mackenzie River, as well as migration stories from the south. And so we understand these borders between Dene communities of belonging, Dene people who are original peoples of current-day Canada, the United States, and Mexico, as two crucial, very impactful borders and boundaries and containment systems that are impacting upon Dene family, Dene knowingness, and Dene nation in what we call Nugutsan, Earth is Woman, and other peoples call Turtle Island and Aviala. So I'm thinking a lot about this concept of indivisible. I've written out on top my paper, I've broken down this word about 8 times. Indigenous, visible, visibility, divisible, divisibility, invisibility, indigenous, invisibilities. All of these words circulate through my mind and my heart. And so I'm really grateful today to be here to witness the Indigenous protocol, enacting a shift in consciousness at NMSU. This walk, this populating of this place here on this stage and here on this campus helps us today as we walk toward commemorating two very important weeks in March internationally, and particularly one that I've come to be quite closely aligned with is the United Nations Convention on the Elimination of Racism and Discrimination, which will be celebrated next week on March 21st. And so there are many pieces and many opportunities to draw together today. But for me, NMSU community is enacting the creation of a bridge across time, space, and culture, aligning itself to a view and a potentially new view of itself, not only in dialogue with, but in relation to the international movement for Indigenous peoples' rights. How is this so? Recognizing that this large-scale galvanizing social movement for the hemispheric recognition of Indigenous peoples' lands, territories, and continuing struggles for sense of belonging with Indigenous place, the crucial source of Indigenous peoples' very survivance, was being created under the shadows of modernizing industrial settler states, unseen and invisible. The modern roots of the rights of Indigenous peoples to assert and demand recognition in our homelands became ignited by a congregation of Indigenous delegates representing Indigenous peoples who survived the legacy of colonialism and genocidal processes across the Americas. Therefore, it is crucially vital, as we begin this journey today, that we have some critical foundations in which to understand and appreciate the Tortuga Welcome Protocol and how this, with the 50-year movement, are intersecting Indigenous rights and human rights. How the Tortuga Welcome Protocol is aligned and furthering our responsibilities and our relationships to Tortuga recognition, and not subjugated beneath the United States federal recognition, Tortuga recognition under international law. For those unfamiliar with critical Native and Indigenous studies, the enactment is important. It was in the latter half of the 19th century in which hundreds of Indigenous nations did not subjugate, nor surrender, nor cede their homelands to the nascent yet escalating settler societies in our midst. In fact, many walked away from heavily unbalanced and inequitable treaty processes with non-Indigenous peoples, also known as settler societies. As was often the case, Indigenous peoples' diplomacies were ahead of the international scene on human rights. Recalling in 1969, the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, legal experts determined it to be completely reasonable, rational, logical, and legal for unilateral withdrawal from treaties. However, the Eurocentric conventions negated Indigenous nations. So over 5,000 delegates of 97 Indigenous nations in 1974 gathered together in the Dakotas. And this manifesto, created by them on that occasion, supports the rights of all Indigenous peoples to live free and take whatever actions are necessary to uphold our sovereignty in our traditional and unceded homelands. This was the largest gathering of Indian people in the 20th century, but for the most part it was censored in the United States, Mexico, and Canada. It was here that the Declaration of Continuing Independence was created. The conference was attended by numerous elders, and the majority spoke no English whatsoever, and the rest spoke broken English. These are from the archives and the testimonies of that gathering. These elders gave the conference and the newly formed International Treaty Council two mandates, which is also relevant to the enactment of protocol here today. The first mandate was to become recognized by the international communities. On September 2007, that would become a part of Western legal tradition when the United Nations endorsed and passed a Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The Indigenous delegates gathered then dominantly from their unrelinquished homelands in the United States, Mexico, and Canada, stated, quote, "We must always remember that we were once a free people, and if we don't, we shall cease to be free, not extinguished, not annihilated, not vanished. There's a difference. The second mandate is to return to our original status as free and independent nations. This collective formations, resurgences, led to the Declaration of the Continuing Independence in June 1974. And so that is really a very important historical marker for understanding the rights for indigenous peoples to reclaim indigenous place and being and belonging. The Declaration's introduction states, quote, "The first International Treaty Council of the Western Hemisphere was formed on the land of the Standing Rock Sioux tribe on June 8, 1974. The delegates meeting under the guidance of the Great Spirit represented 97 Indian tribes and nations from across North and South America," unquote. So with tremendous pride and honor and spirit, a very excited commitment, 5,000 indigenous delegates proclaimed, "We, the sovereign nation and native peoples, recognize that all lands belonging to the various native nations now situated within the borders of the United States and relative nation states are clearly defined by the sacred treaties solemnly entered into between the native nations and the governments of the settler states. We, the sovereign native peoples, charge the United States of gross violations of our international treaties," unquote. Further to that, our predecessor indigenous diplomat delegation declared, quote, "We acknowledge the historical fact that the struggle for independence of the peoples of our sacred Mother Earth have always been over sovereignty of land and beingness and our belongingness. These historical freedom efforts have always involved the highest human sacrifice. We recognize that all native nations wish to avoid violence, but we also recognize that the United States government has always used force and violence to deny native nations basic human and treaty rights," unquote. The delegates responded in turn with the following declarative statement, which is the foundation of the current day struggle, process, and achievement of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And it states, quote, "We adopt this declaration of continuing independence, recognizing that struggle lies ahead, a struggle certain to be won, and that the human and treaty rights of all native nations will be honored," unquote. And in this pursuit of indigenous peoples' justice, the delegates enjoined the non-indigenous settler society to make a bridge, to engage in a process on intergenerational soul-searching, historical clarification, spiritual investigation, and decolonization of the imperialist state practices now considered norms by which states govern over, not with, their own citizens, who were many seeking true democracy. And they disseminated an invitation into the four directions, very similar to the one which we were witnessing and were given this morning through the protocol of the Tortugas claiming a place. And in that invitation, they stated, quote, "We will seek the support of all world communities in the struggle for the continuing independence of native indigenous nations," unquote. So we, the representatives of sovereign native nations, united in forming a council to be known at the International Indian Treaty Council to implement these declarations, have been given this mandate that I and many carry out today before you. The International Indian Treaty Council recognizes the sovereignty of all native nations and will stand in unity to support our native and international brothers and sisters in their respective and collective struggles concerning international treaties and agreements violated by the U.S. and other preceding governments, federations, republics, and other organized mechanisms of settler societies. All treaties between the sovereign native nations and the United States must be interpreted according to the traditional and spiritual ways of the signatory native nations and to the native nations who refuse to sign and cede away their sovereignty. In 1982, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Subcommission on the Prevention of Discrimination and the Protection of Minorities, Jose Martinez Cobo, released a study about the systemic discrimination faced by indigenous peoples worldwide. His findings were released as the study of the problem of discrimination against indigenous populations. And in it said, quote, the UN Economic and Social Council responds to these findings by creating the Working Group on Indigenous Populations, comprised of 5 independent experts as well as indigenous advisors, in order to focus exclusively on indigenous issues worldwide as a major mandate for global decolonization. Its role was to make recommendations to the Commission of Human Rights through the subcommission. And so in consultation with indigenous representatives from around the world, the WGIP began to draft a Declaration of Indigenous Rights in 1985. So the initial draft was developed over 8 years and was submitted in 1993 to the Subcommission on the Prevention of Discrimination and Protection of Minorities. Upon its approval, the draft declaration was sent to the Commission of Human Rights in Geneva, which established another working group consisting of human rights experts and over 100 indigenous organizations. The draft declaration was subject to a series of reviews to assure that United Nations member states that it remained consistent with already established human rights, such as the ILO 169, and did not contradict nor override them. So this is a little bit of the history that for me is incredibly important, underpinning the protocols of space and indigenous place this morning. In 2007, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was endorsed and accepted by a majority of UN nations, but not all. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People is an international instrument adopted by the UN on September 13, 2007, to enshrine, according to Article 43, the rights that, quote, constitute the minimum standards for the survival, dignity, and well-being of indigenous peoples of the world. Most importantly, the Declaration protects collective rights that may not be addressed in other human rights charters or constitutions at the domestic level, emphasizing, which only may emphasize individual rights. And so the UN Declaration safeguards the collective rights and the individual rights of indigenous peoples wherever they live. The Declaration is the product of almost 25 years, therefore, of deliberation by UN member states, indigenous organizations, and many civil society groups and institutions worldwide. However, as I mentioned, not all nation states agreed to the premise that indigenous peoples of the world are original nations and sovereigns. The United States, along with Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, refused to endorse this profound and emergent framework for decolonization worldwide. This led to intense criticism, robust and vigorous debates nationally and internationally, of which their peoples aggressively participated in between 2009 into the present moment. In 2012, the US was a final signatory, as I stated. So we must ask ourselves today, and keep this in our hearts and minds, why is this relevant to today's opening protocols by the Tortuga Nation members? Why is this recitation of very recent historical processes and engagements in indigenous rights within the United States and the Americas a necessary foundation for global decolonization, a core foundation for beginning the journey of or unlearning, teaching, exchange, and reciprocity today? The indigenous protocol we experienced is made possible through the agentic, agency-filled, knowing, and because they are key social actors amongst us who are synergizing transformers, answering the call, ethically, morally, and legally principled, now nearly 50 years in the making of the Indigenous Declaration of Continuing Independence. Here, after centuries of neglect, ignorance, and miseducation, these erroneously categorized as purportedly non-recognized tribes which today are over 400 tribes existing in a shadowy extra-legal space in the other Indian country, the one in the shadows of hidden genocidal histories and violence and assimilative processes. Why is this relevant today as we gather to think together about how new strategies might answer the question about why is it hard to imagine that an official violent assimilative policy such as non-recognition, which is designed to legislatively eliminate a people, that policy being immersed in our everyday lives would be acceptable in a liberal democracy. The continuing policy is just as destructive as historical abuses which predated it. So we must then move forward, and I must move forward in this paper because I've been given my 10 minutes. So today you will see a film, and so I'm not going to narrate very much about it. I think that it speaks on its own. But it did come about in 2007 when I was a passenger in a car heading out of the village of Redford in the Texas-Mexico borderlands in the community of Humano Apaches, who are our cousins and my direct cousins. And I had just spent about a week in the community listening to testimonies of elders and children and families in the border to militarized zone. This is a community which has been quite active nationally on educating the nation about continuing existence of indigenous peoples in the region. You may be familiar with the Humano Apache from Redford. I'm sure some of you have seen the poster of Ezekiel Hernandez, the goat herder, who on May 20th, 1997, was executed by US Marines in a Joint Task Force 6 special operation. So coming out of the community, having collected many oral and audio recordings, my driver and collaborator, a human rights attorney for indigenous people's rights who worked at the University of Arizona, Shauna Howard, was in the middle of a story. And she was recounting the many minefields which women must navigate in the United Nations systems when I received a call from my mother speaking on the phone from El Calaboz. I remember how usually the colossal lithic formations that are scattered about on the land posturing in the Tres Pecos in the far west Texas, located between the Davis Mountains and the Big Bend National Park, especially in one rock, Elephant Rock, near Shafter. But that moment when she called, all of these blurred and just went out of my visual range. When I heard her say, and her voice coming across crackles of the low cellular zone I was in, though I'll never forget that moment and how they catapulted what would become a 10-year journey through the maze-like underworld, the upside down of US laws of dispossession, and the legacy of coloniality in these systems and institutions upholding mass violence as the norm. And she simply said, Margot, you need to find help. The government has people here, and they're going from house to house. They're telling us we have to give them our land rights. They're carrying weapons, but I'm refusing. In El Calaboz, a village where Lipan, Comanche, Nahuatl, Tlaxcalteca, and Basque peoples forged economies and kinship and subsistence, there's a deeply layered narrative and history of resistance to dispossession and indigenous women's refusals. El Calaboz means the dungeon, by the way. There are exactly 4 places in the Americas with this name: Peru, El Salvador, Nicaragua, and the place I call home. El Calaboz signals a deep historical process of dehumanization, destructive practices, and indigenous suffering, as well as refusal. You will see an incredible story about that refusal, but I'm going to go forward and talk a little bit about how I see the wall today. The wall became a huge catalyst, by the way, as oftentimes in Ende history and oral history and creation stories shows us that Ende people have become very resilient because for more than 15,000 years, we have responded in particular ways to incredible cataclysms, eruptions, earthquakes, the earth shattering and clattering about. So that's I think like a huge fixture for Ende, sense of space and place and resilience. But so-called unrecognized indigenous peoples are in fact a large polity of unceded landholders to date, all along the US-Mexico border, which many people don't understand, that those borders are dividing indigenous homelands, such as all across the Canadian-US border are the divided homelands, and that is replicated all throughout the Americas. And so this is an inconvenient truth not only for the nation state, but it's a perceived threat and challenge to numerous federally recognized tribes as well, which are entrapped in a violent and seemingly cemented relationship with the settler capitalist nation state. Neither the US, Mexico, Texas, nor Spain ever successfully subjugated Lipan Apache Aboriginal lands or sovereignty beneath the Euro-Western legal system, and this still holds to the present moment. The wall is not the beautiful wall, as one person is touting, as he traverses lands he's probably never touched before, smelled before, drank the water from, understands that sort of intrinsic thing that happens when you come home and everything just fits. It is not the beautiful wall. The US border wall in the Texas-Mexico region is bifurcated and is bifurcating 65 million acres of unceded Lipan Apache lands. The wall is, in the words of human rights attorney Peter Shea, who litigated Temez versus Chertoff and is a direct descendant of Holocaust survivors, he said it is, quote, a gulag perpetuated by a gang of global syndicated thieves, unquote. The wall is a significant performative stage, and in the words of Humano Apache cacique Enrique Madrid, it is a hyper-mega project to organize and mechanize the transit of capital at any cost. The wall is a mechanism to explode that which is left of the human psyche to shrapnel. The wall is a 200-kilometer circumference from El Calabozo, and there the dungeon where the Apaches and Comanches and Spaniards, as well as indigenous peoples, experience the violent Hispanicism and then Anglo-Saxonism, combat and vie for power to this day. We are very divided in our communities. We are very factionalized, and therefore heteropatriarchy, gender domination, sexual violence, opioid abuse, alcoholism, industrial foods, militarized education, sex trafficking, meth colonization are taking captives of our youth and our families every day without negotiation. The wall isn't the wall. The wall is a process, not an event. The wall is not the wall is merely a piece, a hook, a ploy for a larger strategic military plan funded by the Texas State Agricultural Department. The wall is not the wall is a series of rape houses and zones where self-appointed vigilante organizations construct and enact horrorscapes. In these same spheres and spaces of abjection, the space far outside the legitimized, recognized space, where the settler colonial law will speak only to what is knowable, here there are small towns dotted throughout the space of South Texas. Here there are everyday ordinary citizens of the state recruited into telling lies, obscuring truth, dulling memory, redacting records, masking unmarked mass graves. The domestic news service represses within the US borders, within Texas counties. Citizens deny, deflect, ham and haw about this obfuscation of history, of memory, of an exact written, documented record of hundreds upon hundreds of bodies and dismembered human remains in Brooks County. The wall is not the wall. The wall is an underworld where uniformed officers play Russian roulette with indigenous migrant women and their daughters, where their lives are deemed violable, rapeable, takeable, where dehumanization is transportable from the river to the gulag gate being opened by the armed uniformed officer outside my mother's backyard, to the cash exchanged between them, to the vehicle, to the gun, to the head, to the rape, to the assault on the threat of death. The wall is not the wall. The wall is the state's cover-up of the scene of the crime, the layered historical scenes of crimes in Lipan Apache country. The wall is not the wall. It is a long metal and cement 20-foot gulag space which divides Ende and ceded territory. The wall is a space of necrotic responses by special interest groups and their subjugation to the formation of multiple spatial sovereignties, a violent power and injustice system which is now the norm. In San Fernando, Tamaulipas, it was mostly indigenous peoples who paid the highest price for the unresolved erosion of morals, ethics, and principles of respect. In 2009 and 2012, indigenous women in my community took the Temez case to the United Nations Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination and raised all of these spaces, all of these places, all of these known and unknowns, along with Lipan Apache issues. All of these things are occurring in Lipan Apache homelands. Lipan Apache women feel it's our responsibility to raise these truths alongside our own, because they are our truths. So we're currently in a moment of indigenous decolonization, indigeneity, and adaptation. I'm going to leave you thinking about these words of the philosopher Hikaria Apache V.F. Cordova, who once said, quote, "Above all, humans have prodigious memories. Memory provided the awareness of consequences. All actions come with consequences. To know consequences was to exhibit knowledge and learning. And to know the consequences of actions of those before us was to display wisdom. The past was not dead, an unknown time, for so long as there were people to remember it and hand it down to others. With mention of the past, mention of the future cannot be avoided." And she asked, so what might be required in order for change in our thinking to occur? By witnessing and reordering the order of things, I call our attention to an indigenous poetics of contextualized understanding of indigenous place, peoplehood, and refusal to dispossession. I call us to the framework of domination because we must confront that together. I call us to understand necrotics and state necrotics, which some argue are overpowering the human will to overcome human fragility, doubt, and fear. I merely ask that we consider the possibility and reality that here today we're part of the enactment of a pivotal poetic force and an embodied revelation of the indigenous will to enact agentic beingness and belongingness. By opening the space today for a resurgent indigenous recognition of belonging, we all take our role and our responsibility in poetics as a methodology for addressing contemporary challenges of current day indigenous uprootedness, rejection, trauma, and marginalization, and convert that and transform that to a poetics of being home. Let me share something with you. What I'm wearing is to honor and to keep close to me the prayers of my students who are very happy that I came to Canada and began to develop classes in which their voices and lives are at the center, and their experiences as survivors of residential school history and direct residential school experiences will be shared across and beyond borders. And the arts, it was said by Louis Riel, who was a Métis warrior and protector of his peoples, and who was executed by the Canadian government for his, dignified insistences to protect his people's rights to land and territory. He did sort of project into the future that it would be, or in 100 to 150 years after he was executed, he predicted that the way Indigenous people's rights would be returned would come through a resurgence, and that the arts would lead the way. And this is a interpretation of the impact of non-recognition in the context of Canada that was created by the artist Daphne Odjick, and her work is monumental in Canada for giving voice to the unrecognized and people in the shadows. And so this is a portrait that her son then had transferred to silk textiles so that it could be disseminated further beyond museums and gallery spaces. And so it's a depiction of those who were in the shadows but who emerged through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the voices that work to clarify historical genocides and ongoing processes of genocide and the impact on families, communities, and children, most importantly, who grow up to be 60, 70-year-old returning students in my classroom who are coming back to voice through the power of education in the academy and through Indigenous studies programs and decolonization focused programs. So I just wanted to share that with you and bring it with me across that border.
And I think we do have a question over here.
Hi, thank you very much for being here, and thank you for sharing all that you've shared. It was amazing. I'm a student here, and I was wondering, in speaking and in hearing all of these oral histories and going through all of these things that have been omitted and taken out of history, and being a part and being so connected to these communities, and then going out and educating people about the healing that we're having to do in our own communities, and the work, the extra labor that we're doing to make sure that our histories and our communities are still living and then coming back. What has helped you as an activist, as an academic, as a person to continue your healing within yourself, to keep navigating that, every time you get to something new, it's oh great, we were killed here, oh great, we were stopped here. What healing has brought you through and has kept you going?
That's a good question. That really hits my heart, because it is a struggle to maintain a sense of, I am a direct descendant on both sides of my family, on my father's side and my mother's side, of well-documented genocides, and documented by our own community and documented in various different pieces within the United States records, edited, of course, in particular ways and slant. Nonetheless, it's glorified, actually. It is exalted in Texas. Roadside history is where I find how the settler state narrates the exalting of its actions towards Indigenous peoples. And so I'm reminded by that all the time. But through the TRC process in Canada is really where I have to say, I came face to face with testimonies that sounded exactly like my own, and my parents, my grandparents, my cousins, my schoolmates growing up, people I meet all the time from South Texas and West Texas, who I come to find out are actually my blood relatives. I'm related to almost every single, old family in every single county of South Texas, West Texas, eastern New Mexico, and the northern states of Coahuila and Tamaulipas. So there's, something's wrong here. Somebody's not telling the truth. Is sort of what I came to in my role as a listener in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And that hit home so heavily by about 2012, 13, and so I think I had really a psychotic break, and I will tell you, I came to own, in my role in Canada, and with my students, as they were coming to claim and own the reality of their intergenerational trauma. And I have come to own that and claim it for myself, my mother, my grandmothers, my ancestors who were annihilated, executed, lynched, burned, dismembered, and that truth-telling process is what has helped me to grapple with the hidden history of genocide. Not only in 1873, well documented, but the ones that I myself, along with then, of course, listeners who were listening to me process through my research, archival research, oral research, reading against the grain of many anthropological accounts of Apache experiences, etc. Dr. Jeff Shepard, who was sitting here in the audience, Cynthia Bejarano, and other people who I asked to listen to me as I was sort of wading through the evidence of many things that nobody actually ever researched, that nobody actually paid attention to or organized in a particular way. And so that process also was a healing process. My husband often remarked, you know, on my side of the room is always stacks and stacks of books that I'm reading, and most of them are genocide related. And he said, you're the only person I know in the world who that comforts. I said, that's just because you haven't addressed your own people's history of colonization yet, and it's awakening, and it's empowering, and it finally gives me the affirmation that was needed all along, and it helps me, I believe in the statement that you made, Mr. Taylor, profoundly, because it was how I was taught and raised, that we need to then model that which we perhaps did not get, and I did not get that kind of role modeling when I was raised in South Texas. I lived through the segregation. I have the scars on my body of the segregation in South Texas. And we said all the way up to the case of Tamez versus Chertoff that civil rights have never come to South Texas and to the Lower Rio Grande, nor to West Texas. Civil rights have never come to Native peoples, and civil rights have never come to Native peoples who are unrecognized by the settler state of the United States. So how do you address all of that? You have to take care of yourself. Self-care, decolonize your diet, question the distortions that we have been fed and spoon-fed growing up from the time we entered public schools, which are structured by a state which has built its myth history upon the backs, upon the blood, upon the suffering of our foreparents before us who did not have the opportunity to speak here and to tell their truths. And so creating a truth-telling session in 2012 where Dr. Bejarano and Dr. Shepard and Dr. Shannon Speed at UCLA and community members came together for the first time. Over 125 years, Lipan Apache peoples began to come together to speak to one another. That's how deeply factionalized and divided and separated we have become that we didn't even realize that some of our first cousins lived in West Texas, that some of our crucial relationships to the land and oral histories and creation stories were in eastern New Mexico and West Texas, that our families are the land title holders of many, many places that we were taught, conditioned, and socialized to believe were private property and don't belong to anybody except private property holders. And so when you're confronted with these jarring, contradictory narratives, it does have an impact on your spirit. It's splitting. It's a sort of I liken it to like a psychotic break. And at that point, for me, poetry, writing, speaking, and research has been my salve. Research and finding, and finding methodologies that help my people find our methodologies, determine what are our questions, what are our theories, what are our approaches, what is most relevant to us, and how will we organize that and make that a practice of research that is legitimized within the university. So it's really an interesting thing that an NDA scholar is establishing these in a university in Canada. So there's another sort of break. There's another sort of, rupture that we're confronting. We're embodying that rupture. So we have to take care of one another, and we need to understand how we have internalized processes of destruction in our communities, in our families, in our households, in our relationships with each other. How we have internalized division. We have internalized me, myself, and I. We have internalized, our subject position of, what's in our own best interests. And Native peoples have become deeply colonized by, positioning self-interest. And so we have a lot of walls to address and to name. So in order for ever to be reconciliation, in truth-seeking, my understanding, as I was trained in truth commissions in Barcelona by judges from all the major truth commissions in the world, they always emphasized that there's crucial parts of truth commissions that must occur, and they told me that they believe that I should found a truth commission in the United States, that there's never been an indigenous truth commission here. And they said, you must focus on these things. Naming names is crucial to the success of a truth process. Historical clarification must be upheld, must be well-resourced. Research. Do not deny the people their need to tell their truth. Do not question their truths. Organize around those truths. If you don't have a method, create a new one. And, so most importantly, you can never have reconciliation, which I have to say, I was raised Catholic. But I also have a very important understanding of Catholicism's role in settler colonialism. So it's very important to understand, power and be very clear about that. And our allies within the church are helping the church to shift, right? But there will never be reconciliation without the truth. You cannot have reconciliation before the truth. And unfortunately, many people want to put reconciliation first. But you will not get truth. And therefore, you will not have a healed society. Thank you.